afternoon. Welcome to our symposium. I'm Hoda Mahmoudi. I'm the holder of the Bahá'í Chair for World Peace at the University of Maryland. And I'm pleased to say that we are located in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences. Today's program, I have to tell you, would not have been possible if it wasn't for the work of Dr. Kate Seaman, who is in the back. Thank you, Kate, for organizing today's event. And also in the back is Mr. Malik Wilson, our faculty fellow, who will assist also with today's program. I extend a warm welcome to our three distinguished guests, whom I will introduce one of them, who then will introduce the other two. A reminder to the Introduction to African American Studies class, who's here today, Dr. Kintiba's class. He has asked that you please take notes, because those notes will be relevant to your future assignment. I couldn't break the code any further than that. So, today's program is a hybrid, so it's being recorded, and I have to tell you, we've had over 155 people who are joining us online. So, and these people are from literally all over the world who can join us given the time limitations. So just a brief introduction. The Bahá'í Chair is now in its 31st year at the University of Maryland. And the program promotes an integrative or a holistic approach to global peace and security, looking at humanity as one common humanity. And in this holistic approach, we seek to the necessity, and we speak to the necessity of peace both among the nations of the world and among individuals in the world, because the two have to work together in order to find a better way to reimagine and create a better world. So to do this, our program focuses on basically 5 central themes: systemic racism and the root causes of prejudice, the empowerment of women in peace, global governance and leadership, human nature, and the challenges of the degradation of the environment and climate change. So in order to address these challenges, we hold meetings like today, where we invite some of the top scholars from around the world to come and speak to us about their research, their work that addresses the challenges that we face in relation to the barriers to peace. And of course, today's program is no exception in that regard. And in this instance, we are really looking forward to what our panelists have to tell us about the two sides of colonialism and decolonialism. Now, today we have a moderator, Dr. John Drabinski, who is actually a professor in the Department of African American Studies, African American and Africana Studies, and also in the Department of English. In a minute, I will go over his publications, but just to tell you that I will leave it to him to introduce our distinguished presenters. Dr. Drabinski focuses his teachings and writings on the philosophical dimensions of Black Atlantic intellectual tradition, with particular emphasis on post-colonial theory, the Francophone Caribbean, and the United States. He has published 4 single-authored books, and I think there are many more that are to come, including most recently Glissant and the Middle Passage, Philosophy, Beginning, Abyss, and Levinas and the Post-Colonial Race, Nation, Order, or Other, which was awarded the Frantz Fanon Book Prize from the Caribbean Philosophical Association. He has edited books and journal issues dedicated to key figures in Atlantic thought, including Frantz Fanon, Jean-Luc Godard, Edouard Brisson, as well as dozens of articles on themes of memory, language, culture, and politics. He's currently completing a book-length study of James Baldwin's, on James Baldwin, which is entitled So Unimaginable a Price, Baldwin and the Black Atlantic. It's under the contract with Northwestern University Press, and a short book on postmodern motifs in Afro-Caribbean thought titled, What is the Afro-Postmodern? Very interesting book titles. So with no further ado, I'd like to ask Professor Drabinski to please come on stage and introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thank you. That was really nice. I was listening to that. I was like, this person sounds impressive. I can't say I will live up to that. And I appreciate the many more books to come part. It's good, my aspiration as well. So I wanted to say a few things about the themes under discussion and then say just a few words about our speakers today. First of all, it's an immense pleasure to introduce today's speakers and invite them to present on these topics for discussion and moderate the conversation that follows. And thank you to the Baha'i Chair for World Peace for hosting the event. I really appreciate it and inviting me to be in this moderating role. It's a really exciting moment, and I think it's going to be a really fantastic discussion. On a personal note, this is very, very personal, but both my children did their preschool care with a woman who did it at home, blending Montessori principles and Baha'i faith, and it has such an impact on my family. So I have a sort of sentimental moment here as well. So we're gathered here under the rubric of the study and conversation around anti-colonialism and decolonization. And these two terms are both fraught and I think have a peculiar absence and presence in our contemporary moment. I think we rarely see the term anti-colonialism discussed these days, even as we often rightly frame practices of economic domination, of military funding of invasive and genocidal wars, and the persistence of white Western hegemony, broadly speaking, as neo-colonial. The colonial has always called for and witnessed the presence of the anti-colonial. Domination and war have their limits. There's always dissent. Perhaps there is reason to revive this now old term, anti-colonial, and bring it into the present. I think it's forever relevant, or hopefully not forever, but still relevant. It's surely an important diagnostic, and it's no surprise that it has attached itself to our moment in Gaza, now perhaps southern Lebanon, and so many other sites of warring conflict that don't get headlines but require our moral reflection. Colonialism is a kind of addiction for the West and its satellite states. Decolonization, however, has a very different history, usage, and diagnosis. Frantz Fanon's last work from 1961, The Wretched of the Earth, introduced the term in the most visceral kind of way, identifying the purposeful political violence with not only anti-colonial work to drive out the colonizer in Algeria and elsewhere, but also decolonizing work. That's the work of purging the remnants of colonial presence and domination from every element of life in the colony, the psyche, educational institutions, cultural production, legal systems and their foundations, and how we think about and configure communal relations. And I think that really gets to the heart of so much of what both of our speakers today work on. That was 1961, written from colonial Algeria, but also written to the rest of the continent of Africa, then the global South more broadly. And we inherit this term from Fanon and others. But its meaning has become so much more expansive, and with that expansiveness, a whole host of critics and criticisms of its deployment. Some might even title a book against decolonization. What does it mean to decolonize our classrooms, or to say that we want to attach this word to our classrooms, to our curricula, to our syllabi, our faculty compositions, our speaker series, and all those things that make a professor's life a professor's life? Is that an abuse of the term, or does the very question of decolonizing these aspects of our lives reveal the colonial hangover of our deepest habits. These are complicated questions. We can't answer these questions in a single book or in a single conversation like the one we're about to have today. But it's such an important critical frame around what we do and how we do things on a university campus. The free flow of ideas, the periodic restrictions on them, and the habits we have around stating what matters, and why all reveals so much about how our habits of thinking inherit the colonial and the anti-colonial past. What matters to us? How do we talk about it? What is our default and accomplished critical literacy? Literally, what do we read and in what languages? These questions might reveal habits deeply embedded in colonial values and cultural institutions of scholarship and conversation. How do we get jarred out of those habits if we want to be different and to make a different world? We read, we listen, we discuss, we study, we learn languages, we read again, we study again, and we discuss again. This is what makes diverse, challenging, and genuinely global campuses valuable to who and what we are as institutions, but also more intimately, who and what we are as a people, as humanity. I'm thrilled that we have our two speakers here today, Olufemi Taiwo from Cornell University and Jean-Michel Mabeko-Tali from Howard University. And I'm thrilled that we have them as speakers for a number of reasons. First, their brilliance and insight will no doubt be a treat and give us much to think about. It's something I really love about being a professor, and I loved about being a student, is you just get to sit and listen. Somebody else's hard work becomes something that makes you shift your perspective. I love doing that hard work and hoping that it shifts perspectives, and I like being a student in these moments as well as I go sit on this stage and listen. Professor Taiwo is one of the foremost philosophers, and as a philosophy PhD, I will say this with all confidence, working on African traditions and the challenge that the thought of Africa poses to critical theory, to politics, to questions of language and expressive culture. Professor Mabeko-Tali, a specialist in Central African history, has written with seriousness on multiple sites in African history and politics, with special emphasis on Angola and Congo and their place in modern political history. Already the richness of their contributions can be anticipated. These are expansive geographies and many multiple forms of thought that lie right at the heart of how we organize ourselves as communities, nations, and global humanity. Examining how we organize thinking, politics, and legal thought is at the center of what they'll discuss here today. And so much is at stake. And I mean this, I'm thankful for both of them for their time and for the thoughtfulness of the forthcoming reflections. As well, I'm so happy that the Baha'i Chair for World Peace has convened this exchange of ideas, because the American Academy is still so profoundly neglectful of African history, culture, philosophy, and politics. Despite the place of Africa in world history, despite the immeasurable contributions of Africa to political and cultural life across centuries, American systems of higher education still pay painfully little attention to the continent. This pair of presentations and the discussions that follow take a small but important step toward remedying this problem at the heart of academic life here at University of Maryland, and I hope more steps follow. I always want to think bigger than our moment. There's so much to learn, to study, and with which to engage, so let this moment be a pivot point toward a better university here at University of Maryland, a university with a wider vision of what will be discussed or must be discussed and how we'll discuss our most vital ideas. To the point of today's gathering, the vital ideas of how we found our political inheritance and the terms of reckoning with the past and interval to new futures. This is an aspirational and probably misplaced or overblown sentiment, but I think that beyond what we're about to hear and discuss, this is an occasion that calls us to wider reflection on what it is that we do and what voices show up in that doing. So in that spirit and with that enthusiasm, let me turn the conversation over to the two people you actually came to hear talk. We'll begin with Femi and then Jean-Michel.
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you, Kate, for our exchange and help me understand how this works. So I did propose this topic because we are going through a very difficult time as human beings with war everywhere. And because that, some of the concept, like human rights, genocide, are part of the debate today. The problem is that the concepts are what they are. Coming from a continent that was largely colonized, and as a scholar, I deal with the debate about concept and how they can be subject to bias and sometimes of exclusion when it comes to define the origin of this or that concept. Because colonization, the history of Africa, I'd go through, what Mudimbe is a great scholar from DRC, Congo, from George country. What he called the colonial library, meaning that the knowledge of Africa was done through the vision of the European, the knowledge accumulated by European, administrator, colonists and explorers and so on. And so this was used as the basis for African history, something that African scholars began challenging mostly after World War II, and to try to write the history of Africa based on an African perspective. I spent 10 years working with UNESCO with my colleague to write, to elaborate manual for African school from primary school to high school. And one of the first work was to try to, what we call, demine the narrative on African history. Like, when I live in a country at war, you don't work what you want because you kind of mine everywhere. So when you take any text about Africa, it's full of bias, full of, And so the first work was how to demine all this and to write an history based on an African perspective. And so my today is to make comparison between two very important documents. The British or English Magna Carta of the 1216 and the Mandan Constitution or Kurkan-Fugan Charter from the Empire of Mali, West Africa, of the same century, 1236. These two documents were written on the same moment, and they give us different vision of what you can call today human rights, different vision of the place of each citizen in the society. And the British, and understand them, think that the Magna Carta of the 1216 is at the origin of human rights. African scholars challenge that, say, no, it is not inclusive, because that charter came from the dispute between King John and the barons. The barons want more land, and they made pressure on the king to have more land. And the king was put in the position of having to, elaborate that very important document, or 67 article, and giving more right, more access to land, not to everyone, but to the barons. And of course, there are a lot of things positive there, and that explain the claim from Britain about the fact that this is the moment of the birth of human rights. When we compare with the Kurukan-Fuga or the Mandan Constitution, there are a lot of difference. Yes, to remind you, the Empire of Mali was a large empire that went from 1226 to 1670. It was a very powerful kingdom, rich. You may know about one of his kings when he became Muslim and went to visit Mansa Musa, went to go to, as any Muslim, to the Mecca. He brought with him so much gold that the price of gold just went down. He gave gold to everyone. This very rich, effectively rich kingdom. So when this empire was created by Sundiata Keita, he dictated this constitution, the Kunkan-Fugan constitution. And for us as African scholar, it was the most inclusive text when you compare with the English Magna Carta. And let's remember that we are talking about the feudal time in Europe, though in the case of Mali, we don't talk about feudal system. There was no feudal system there. And in feudal system, land is the basis of everything. And the access to land was not for everyone, you know that. So in the case of Mali, the difference is there because land was open to anybody in the kingdom. Let me, I think when you compare with these two documents, the King John Magna Carta of 1215, let me just read one part. I think this summarizes the spirit of that very important document. And I say it's legitimate for the British to think that this is, the basis of what you call today human right. It's legitimate. Though as African, I said, no, we can't dispute that. So it is say, give me just a few minutes, says moreover, it's Old English, for God and the amendment of our kingdom for the better allaying of the quarrel that has arisen between us, the king, and our barons. You don't talk about popular pressure. It was between him and the baron, who began just somehow challenging him, blackmailing him for more land, otherwise we'd be in trouble. So he gave more land, and from that basis, he began to elaborate something that, took in consideration all the aspects of the life of kingdom. So the essential is about how to satisfy the baron and to give them, the possibility of giving to their heir what they earn. So this was what you can call the right by status. You get the right not because you are everybody in the society, but you are the baron. And this makes a lot of difference if you remember what was the feudal system, what was the place of the peasant in the feudal system. And so this is the difference between King John Magna Carta and the Kunkan-Fugan constitution of the Empire of Mali. The Mandan constitution went from social problem to environment problem. Just to give you some the place of women in society. You don't find it in King John Magna Carta. Article 14 and 16, let me read it very short, of what is said about the place of women in the Empire of Mali. Article 14, never offend women, our mothers. Article 16, women, apart from their everyday occupation, should be associated with all our management. It's very modern, look like today. About how to treat, person in bondage, whatever the reason of bondage, whether prisoner of war or people who were enslaved because they, earned money to someone. Article 20, it says, do not treat your slave. We are the master of the slave, but not the bag he carries. About the access to land, the key issue here when we compare with the British Magna Carta. Article 32. There are 5 ways to acquire property: buying, donation, exchange, work, and inheriting. Any other form without convincing testimony is doubtful. We don't find this in the Magna Carta. The access to land is required based on the right by statutes, because you are the top part of the elite of the society. And the environmental concern. Article 32, it is said, I'm sorry. Oh yeah, 38, sorry about that. It is said, before setting fire on the bush, don't look down at the ground. Raise your head in the direction of the top of the trees to see whether they bear fruit or flower. And another article about how you should take care of your cows, make sure that doesn't disturb anybody around and doesn't damage the nations. And war crimes, part of the conversation today. How you treat your enemy. Article 41, you can kill the enemy, but don't humiliate him. You are at war, okay, you are right to kill, but please kill him, don't humiliate him. If you do that, this is a war crime. It sounds common, I think, today. So it's, okay, the English Constitution 76 article, this one is 44, but what I want, my point here was that the claim from the British that this, the Magna Carta of 1216, is the source of human rights, African scholars say, don't think so, because the constitution of the Mandan Empire was much more inclusive. It goes from the place, how to educate the kid, for example, educate the land, to environment, how you take care of your environment. So this is part of our conversation today. So the idea that, what we challenge is the Eurocentric vision of all of this concept. The idea that human right is an European creation, we challenge it. No, all society have their own specificity. So in the elaboration of human rights, we need to take into account the diversity of civilization. What is good for you may not be for others, for example. So these can make human rights much more inclusive than just, and I don't talk about the double standard. You know that, this one was claimed today. Why do you treat some war criminal and in the different way that treat others? An example, in 2012, United Nations had soldiers in Central African Republic. These, among them, a French soldier. They raped kids and girls, boys and girls. And the local authority grabbed the soldier to bring to justice. French president said, if you do that, I'll bomb you. When they took the French soldier back to France, they are free. If an African rape any European girl in France, he's done for his life. Thank you.
Good afternoon. Are you here? Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you very much. First, I want to thank the Bahá'í chair, Oda and Kate at the back, for asking me to be a part of this conversation, and to thank my old friend John for saying yes to chairing it, and my co-speaker who I'm just meeting, and I look forward to conversing with beyond today. I was trying to figure out how to make this worth your while, since I'm not giving a full lecture. So what I've decided to do is to say a few words about the book and what motivated it, connect some personal dimensions that have borne out the thesis of the book, and you're going to see why that's important to me, in a moment. And then hope that I say enough to make it worth your while, and so that we can have a good conversation. When I wrote the book, it was not the book that I wanted to write. As I said in the introduction to it, in the acknowledgements, this book came out of a conversation with a friend of mine, who was the first person who said to me, I think there's a book here based on the original paper that became the book. And I said, don't go there. There's no book there. He said, hear me out. And over the course of that phone conversation, the 4 chapters of this book came out of that conversation. So that's why I said in the acknowledgement that this is his book, not mine. But the reason why this is important is because, given the predominant lay student constitution of this audience, I always say to all of you, always get yourself interlocutors among your ranks who can produce books for you from talking with them. And I've always had that from my student days, and that has not, this person I just spoke about, he and I have already spoken this morning. And he was an undergraduate when I went back to Nigeria to teach, and we have since become friends. He's also a full professor now, so you know how old I am. And not a recent full professor of long standing. But that's very important at one level, that you have interlocutors that you disagree with, who are very honest with you, and who occasionally will tell you, I don't think that's going to fly. And when they tell you that, please listen to them. Because the outsiders that you are going to be sending your stuff to, they don't know you, they don't care about you. But your friends who don't want you to go out looking bad, they do care about you, and if they tell you something's not going to fly, based on what they know of you and what you're trying to do, say yes to them and let it go. First point. 2, one of the earliest times that I made a presentation on the book, I said something which somebody just put on Twitter, as the conversation was going on. And I said, I did not write my book against decolonization for those who are decolonizing. When I said that, it was an off-the-cuff remark. But it has since become something that last week, when I was giving a lecture at another place, I actually made it the opening part of my lecture. And the reason is very simple. Over the 2 years that the book has been out, it is now obvious to me that what I said in the book about calling the decolonization industry an industry, a cult, is being borne out every day. And this started from the time that I started working on the book, the original paper that led to the book, the conference where I gave it. A fellow professor of philosophy said to me at breakfast the following day, I spent the whole night thinking about your lecture yesterday, and I couldn't come up with a very decent rejoinder to you. And here's the punchline. He said, but I'm sure there must be a way for us to preserve this idea. If a professor of philosophy cannot find a rejoinder, but thinks that we must keep the idea, that's no longer argumentation. That's cultic behavior. That's ideology. It does not have any other name. And the reason why this becomes important to me is that the audience, one of the audiences I wrote the book for, is made up of graduate students who are often put, under pressure by their supervisors to go along a certain line. And many of you undergraduates are also put under the same thing because your teachers think that this is the in thing to do and that's where you should go. And you have some quizziness about it, but you really don't know how to articulate it. So my book is there for you to say, according to Olufemi Taiwo, you don't have to take responsibility. So that's the other reason why I wrote the book. And the same goes for junior, faculty who may get, literally overawed by their senior people who think that they are not going along, the lines. So that's the second part. The third part, and this is the most important to me, is that I am now more convinced than ever before that this stuff actually shuts down argument. It shuts down thinking. And it does not allow young people to see the vastness of the horizons that are open to them. And this came clear to me when I gave a lecture earlier this year at another place. And a particular postdoc student in the audience kept pushing me to show me that there is still something here that needs to be, salvaged. That was when I had an epiphany, so I said to him, here's the problem. You need to take colonialism and push it off the pedestal on which you have placed it. And once you do that, you are going to be amazed at all the things that begin to show up about possible ways of understanding the world. He came to me during reception and said, I had never thought of it that way. You are right. Because what I find is people always take me back to colonialism. And I said, I quote somebody in the book, one of our top historians from Africa, Ade Ajayi, who said that colonialism was an episode in African history, not an epoch. And he published that in 1969. People sidestep that argument now. And the reason he said that is, if you make colonialism the center, you turn the history of Africa into an element of the history of Africa's conquerors. And he said Africa's history is longer, more complex, and colonialism was just another episode of outsiders, but also insiders. That's the other dimension that people don't pay attention to. And I now find that all our young people in Africa, you can't get them to think about anything. They always want to decolonize. And now, where I am, when students write to me, prospective students, who say, oh, I've read your work, I want to come and work with you, I'm interested in decolonizing, I write to them, I am not your teacher. And my reason is very simple, not because I'm not interested in debate, but from my experience, people come in with that position, I push back against them, they think I'm trying to convert them to my way of thinking. I have zero interest in conversion. I don't want any disciples. That's an inside joke between me and my students. And you know why? I can share it with you too. Remember what happened to the one with disciples? No. I don't want that fate. So I have no interest in disciples whatsoever. And that now connects to one of the fruits of allowing my students to confront these vastness horizons that are opened up to them. Talk about serendipity. So this is the Bahá'í chair, right? And my student, who is now a teacher too, is finishing a book of essays by an Egyptian philosopher, essays that he has translated and is introducing. And he did me the honor of asking me to write a blog for the book. And guess what? I knew this Egyptian philosopher, Professor Murad Wahba. I had met him as a graduate student in Nigeria in 1981. And I knew his work that was available in English, but there was a lot more to him available in Arabic that was never accessible to any one of us. So in the last 3 years, one other young scholar in Texas has translated some of his essays under the title Fundamentalism and Secularization. And now my own ex-student has translated another batch of his essays. And one of the essays in the book talk about serendipity. And of course, I had to read the book to write a blog. Okay. Was on a correspondence between a Grand Mufti of Egypt, Mohammed Abdu, at the turn of the 20th century, and Leo Tolstoy. You all know who Leo Tolstoy was. And the Grand Mufti was expressing to him some of the debates about the Enlightenment in Egypt and the comparison between Christianity and Islam and which one is more akin to freedom, more promotive, and so on and so forth. And was writing Tolstoy to check his opinion. And Tolstoy's letter back to him, reproduced in this essay, had 2 questions at the end. And one of those questions was asking the Grand Mufti what he thought of Baha'u'llah. Now, this, my student, now my teacher, but was even my teacher when he was still my student, because he was the one who introduced me to the thinker who was the vector of modernity in Egypt, on whom he eventually wrote his dissertation, Rifa al-Tatawi. And the one who was the vector of modernity in Japan, Fukuzawa, and I have the monograph that he shared with me. And this is what I mean now by the personal dimension, because by opening him up and leaving him to go look for things and not getting cathected to what has been done to us, to what Europe has always done, that agency has now yielded these great insights that are also educating me as a teacher. I cannot put any monetary value on that. So that's the more dimensional part. Of course, I have been introduced to the Bahá'í faith as an undergraduate in Nigeria in the 70s, when a linguist joined our linguistics department at my university. His name was David Gruber, and he was an adherent of the Bahá'í faith. So I'd known that, from the time that I was an undergraduate, and see how all these things are coming, together in a way that I could not have planned. The final point that I would like to make in the time that remains to me is, in the introduction to my book, I used music as a way to show how, when decolonizers, that's what I call them, insist that nothing of the colonial period must survive after independence, otherwise it will be evidence of colonization. They cannot be more wrong, because by so doing, they are practically denying Africans and other colonized peoples one of the fundamental privileges of being human, which is you beg, you steal, you borrow, whatever it is that suits you from the treasury of human experiences, including the treasury of those who have oppressed you. And I use the example in my book of African Americans. This was the country, the only one where those who were enslaved were not even considered human, they were considered chattel. But those who were enslaved never for once thought of themselves as chattel. And because you learn by ear, especially when you are denied formal education and so on and so forth, many of the things that black people in this country turned into a brand new civilization, music, cuisine, dressing, literature, name it, religion, including their take on Islam, they got from those who had enslaved them, mixed with what they had brought from Africa, what they got from native peoples, and so on and so forth. And they have created, probably outside of native peoples, the only original culture that this country ever produced. So now, when people make it seem as if for you to borrow anything from those who colonized you means that you are still under colonialism, they don't know what the hell they're talking about. And they are then saying that Africans may not exercise that fundamentally human prerogative of taking whatever they want from wherever they wish towards whatever end that they have. And I argue that once you do that, there are many things that are happening that will be illegible to you. So just before I went to give a lecture last week, There's a particular program on radio. I don't know whether there's anyone here who is familiar with it. And if you are, please raise your hand and I'll acknowledge you. The program is called Afropop Worldwide. It's a syndicated radio program run by a Cameroonian, Georges Collinet. Georges Collinet is a walking encyclopedia of music of the Black world wherever it shows up. And one of the most recent documentaries that he did, and I will read it out to you in the concluding part of my conversation with you, was on Africa and India. At Afropop, we absolutely believe in the magic of music. And this week's Hip Deep episode is all about how that magic happens where Africa and India meet. It's a story of musical crossovers, cultural fusion, and connections that have shaped both worlds in exciting and unexpected ways. The result? A blend of sounds and stories that continue to inspire and unite people across generations and continents. We begin with the Sidi community, descendants of African soldiers who arrived in India in the 13th century. Their African-influenced Sufi trance music, performed at shrines dedicated to the Black Muslim saint Baba Gaur, is a powerful reminder of how music preserves history and resilience. Next, we step into 1930s Bombay, where African-American jazz musicians lit up the Taj Mahal Hotel. Their influence didn't just entertain, it shaped the iconic sounds of indie film music. It's a striking example of cultures coming together to create something lasting. In Sri Lanka, we dive into the Afro-Indo-Portuguese pop style of Bahá'í, a vibrant genre that's fueled celebrations for decades. We also hear from jazz flutist Deepak Ram, who reflects on growing up Indian in apartheid South Africa, showing how music bridges even the deepest divides. Let me just stop there. See all the places that are brought together by this very human phenomenon of music. My argument is a whole lot of what people do in decolonizing cannot even see that, much less articulate it. Because the binaries that dominate that discourse do not allow for serious thinking, cannot embrace complexity, and I warn students against it, not because I want them to follow me, but because I want them to be free to snatch from wherever in the world whatever of the human experience speaks to them without their having to apologize for their choices. And finally, a Ugandan guy went to Punjab University in the 90s, fell in love with Buddhism, signed up to become a Buddhist monk, and now runs a Buddhist monastery near Kampala in Uganda. Welcome to The Human. Thank you very much.
So I'll go ahead, if it's okay, I know people usually like to settle a little bit for questions, both online and in person. But let me thank both of you, this was fantastic. Short presentations that in terms of thoughtfulness and things for us to think about are very serious. And so I wanted to start maybe, each of you in sequence with a question. I was gonna ask you about, how in thinking about, in a contrasting way, about these two foundations of political and legal organization, how you think about those differences, because I found it interesting, that the environmental aspect was something that you not that you emphasized it, but that was such a point of contrast. So I'm wondering how you think about these differences. There are a lot of, many ways to think about why these differences are differences, but I thought especially to ask you if you had thoughts about this around the word empire, about the way empires are constructed as imaginations of both internal relations to a state, but also the way those internal relations in an empire relate to the empire's other or outlying territories. You know, where do you see that contrast drawing from? Is it just deep cultural beliefs, or is it about also other political practices, or even environmental factors of being in places of scarcity and abundance that resonate differently and therefore are reflected in law and political order?
Thank you.
You can just take it out.
Oh. Thank you. This was my point when I said that, concept like human rights or and mostly practice linked to this concept need to take into account the fact that we talk about humanity as well here, and you are in America. You are people from DC, or they come from California, and you come from different backgrounds. When you put this on the scale of humanity as well, the diversity is huge. So when you define this kind of concept, we need to take into account that diversity. One of the problem we have with African scholars sometimes with some concepts that they are too Eurocentric. And it looks like humanities is just linked to Europe, and out of Europe there is no humanity. Think about, human rights began in Africa. Okay, so you think about millions of years of an elaboration of way of life. So if we want a concept that can be inclusive, we need to take into account that diversity. Otherwise, you are going to make a mistake by applying to other people something that is from your own background, and these people have the right to say, we don't agree with you. Think about the education of kids. Think about the status of women and all this. This is part of all the background of any polities, kingdom or empire with a modern state. So the two documents reflect the different economic systems of that time. You have feudalism in England. You don't have feudalism in Mali, part of Mali. We talk about the same century, the 13th century. So the access to land in Mali is linked to the local vision of, the right of each citizen to have access to what is seen as a common property, land, belongs to everyone. So in England, you're feudalism. We know how to work in feudalism. You have the king, and you have access to land based on your place in that hierarchy, what you call, the right by statutes. So in this case, the baron was very important in the case of feudalism in England. We don't find the same kind of structure in Mali. The same century, with few years of difference. So this is important as to understand the two documents. And about the ecology, we talk about, Mali was a huge empire. It went from Sahel to Atlantic Ocean. And the northern part was very close to the Atlantic region of Africa. So ecology was very important. Environment was something very important. You don't cut a tree like that. You are destroying the. So that's why you find this in that constitution of the 13th century. When you put fire in the bush, make sure that you are not destroying the tree that's full. So because you are going to destroy the life if you do that. And when you keep your cattle, make sure that they are not damaging the environment. So these English may not have this kind of, because they did not have this kind of environmental priority and problem that Mali had, mostly northern part of Mali. So each document reflects its time, local culture, and the local vision of human life. One of the first articles about women. don't mistreat women or mother. And one article about the divorce, how to divorce, and husband and the reason of divorce, I think Article 35 something. So you find in that constitution of this African empire everything that's part of our debate today. In the English constitution, 67 article, everything is about land and mostly about the elite, though they condemn, the arbitrary prison for that constitution. But it is not definitely inclusive. I sent to George the two documents, if you can distribute to his student. I used to my student to make the comparison between the two, because they reflect, the kind of economic system we have in England and part of Mali, and local culture, and local relationship with the environment.
And
It's okay. Oh, yeah,
I don't know if people share or not share microphones in the age of COVID. And Femi, I want to ask you a question. I really like this question of the difference between the epoch and the episode. But I wondered, in thinking about how some of this language might shift a bit, and I don't mean overturn, but shift a little bit if we move away from cultural production. Right, and I love music as an example, and students of mine who, when we talk about creolization and these kinds of Caribbean ideas, music is such a fabulous example of different kinds of practices around cultural difference. But I wondered, when we think about political institutions, how the epoch distinction and also the meaning of decolonization might shift. And I'm thinking about ways of characterizing post-colonial states across the world, post-colonial states as inheriting colonial ideas of kleptocracy, right, of greed, of human rights abuses, and these sorts of things. I know that's, certainly for Frantz Fanon, this was one of his calls for a decolonization of political institutions, is that he worried that they would carry, that without this work of decolonization, they would carry those inheritances or inherit those kleptocratic ways. And then that's how the neo-colonial comes about. Not so much about the presence of Europe, but the presence of those values in political institutions, which are so much less creative and so much less engaging, but also so much more fatal and violent.
Thank you. Is this working?
Just keep it close.
Thank you very much, John. In fact, I think that is precisely the problem of lack of clarity about the terms. One, colonialism is not one, as I said in my book. Okay. Two, Greeks, Belgians, South Koreans, Indonesians, Brazilians are all, and good old United States are all ex-colonies. People forget that. And my point is, if you are doing theory, okay, the fewer concepts you have and the more you can explain with them, the better your theory is. So when people now make colonialism almost as if it's something now it's global north and global south, which I think are meaningless. Okay? Because I ask people, where do you put South Korea? Where do you put Brazil, right now? And for those of us who grew up in the 70s, shouting dependency theory and the impossibility of building capitalism in the periphery, to now look at Brazil, to look at Mexico, to look at Indonesia, to look at South Korea, to look at India, all doing that. And Brazil is the one I always tell my students to go study. Because the man who spearheaded, the neoliberal revolution in Brazil was also one of the leaders of dependency theory back in the day. So again, instead of giving students this, sharp divisions and all that that do not reflect the complexity. So when you now talk about these institutions being colonial, I think that's wrong. In fact, another lecture that I give now, I call it Africa's Second Struggle for Freedom. The struggle for independence was the first struggle, and that was to free these gross representations called countries, states, and so on and so forth. Africa's political thinkers knew that that was not the end, that was just to get rid of colonialism, and they did. That's why I said colonialism ended in Africa. There's only one outstanding case of colonialism in Africa as we speak, and it's called Western Sahara. It used to be called Spanish Sahara. Okay? And part of what I did in my book, which people are not paying attention to, is I went back and reread Kwame Nkrumah on neocolonialism. And then there's another African thinker that nobody knows about, and I have been a scholar of him for over 30 years. His name is Obafemi Awolowo. Okay? And as far as I'm concerned, the most modern African political thinker, not Nyerere, not Nkrumah, it's Obafemi Awolowo. Meanwhile, he gave a speech in 1977 where he said, neocolonialism is what we do to ourselves, quote unquote. My challenge is, don't take anybody's word for it. Please, as you study Nkrumah, study Awolowo, and come to your own conclusion about who has a better take on what neocolonialism is. And the reason why Awolowo said that was that he was trying to, emphasize the question of agency. That after independence, you are now free to order your lives the way you want. Now, for people to think that the reason you are failing to order your lives the way you want is because of the continuing impact of colonialism, then I have two options for you. Either Africans are permanent children that racists say we are, or we are adults who just make lousy choices all the time. There's no midway between those two. If people can find a midway, please, especially young people, share it with me. So every time people say, oh, look at what happened to Lumumba, look at what happened to Nkrumah, so I said, yes. For the most part, the hand that pulled the trigger were African hands. Why doesn't that happen in South Korea? Why doesn't that happen in India? Maybe when our scholars begin to hold up a mirror and begin to take a very deep look at, okay, why do we do these things? Right now, African countries are selling land, and there's at least one country, I will not tell the name. I have it. I said, oh, if they're giving you a hard time getting land, come to us, we'll give it to you for free. So in recent lectures, I have said, in 70 years, our great-grandchildren will be asking China for reparations for what China is doing in the continent right now. So if people want to believe that colonialism is the way to explain it, and that Africans have no responsibility, I wish them well, but that's not my take.
Raise your hands and people will bring the microphone to you.
Excuse me. First of all, thank you so much for enlightening discussion. I just wanted to bring this to something. This summer, I was in Kenya, and as you probably are familiar, there were all these street protests that became quite violent. Not just in Nairobi, but this has happened in Nigeria and a number of places. And I was wondering whether you could just maybe reflect a little bit on where this fits into what you see happening there, and to what extent, I guess, to Professor Mabeko-Tali, is this, in your mind, a exercise in decolonization, or Professor Taiwo, or is this actually exercising agency in the sense of away from colonization, and this is about the price of bread being.
I'm sorry, some part of what you say was lost because the microphone was on.
It was just, I was just asking about what your thoughts are on some of the protests that you see, by young people in many places in Africa, that many of which have become violent, and I know the one in Kenya was this summer, and I wanted to just get a sense from the two of you how you view those in light of this conversation.
Yeah, thank you. What is going on right now in the continent, for me, is in many countries, like the new kind of decolonization that is taking place. And when you see what is going on mostly in West Africa, for example, you have a wave of coup, and those who make this coup are mostly young people, young military, 32 years old, 30 years old, and of course, I don't like coup, by principle, but I want to remind what Napoleon Bonaparte said. Napoleon came to power by coup, if you remember. He said, a coup is just an opinion that gets bayonet. Because these people, this young military, they reflect the economic situation in many of African countries. The decolonization of the French Empire was, it was not really decolonization. France was put, just an example, because many of these coups are taking place in Francophone Africa. France was put in the situation of having to decolonize because, one, the defeat in Vietnam. French military was defeated in 1954 in Dien Bien Phu. And the Algerians saw that and say, they did it, we can do it. The same year in November, armed struggle began in Algeria. So France was caught in the middle of pressure, and de Gaulle accepted to decolonize, kind of, okay, I give you some sovereignty, but you know what, I keep economy, foreign affairs, military, and I have an advisor in the palace of this black guy there. And this was the reality. So after 62 or 64, some of the 60 years of independence, you still have a lot of problems. The economy is still kind of colonial economy. You produce raw material, you export, you don't transform in local. Meaning don't give enough employment to young people. So this is the key issue there. So you have a lot of young guys crossing the Sahara, crossing the Mediterranean Sea in search of, paradise. And every year you have hundreds of young Africans who die in the Mediterranean Sea because the difficult situation in their country. So this is the result of this bad decolonization. So the new wave of coup right now are linked to that new vision of what should be independence. And when this is the basis of the violence, but you have also identity violence in many places. But in my opinion, I published a book, a comparison between Angolan and Congolese transition, with even the reinvention of identity by the elite, by local intellectuals, when they are in political trouble. So these explain many civil war in some places. And in my country, the Congo, on the side of the river, because of the Congo, the civil war was in reality a long coup organized by French oil company. Why? Because the new president was elected, decided to renegotiate the contract of oil, say, you give us 15%, it's not enough, want more, and French oil company organized a coup, which was a long civil war. In the other side of the river, because we have the two Congo, the Congo River, war in DRC is linked to raw materials. So many of these unrest is linked to, effectively, a difficult economic situation, unemployment, and that is it. So it's the base of everything. In Kenya, I remember the violence after the election, after Kenyatta won election, and what I understood was that the Kikuyu were in power again after the or the Kenyatta, and young Kenya with power, and that the Ruto, I mean, what is his name, Ojinga, was not happy because, say, once again, the Kikuyu are monopolizing the power. I'm not sure that the young people went from some of the Nairobi neighborhood to downtown. They went there because the real interest. I think the elite use them, in my opinion. It's easy to use identity, factor for violence. So it's a mix of economic situation and unemployment mostly, and also mixed with identity issue. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that question. I wrote a book several years ago, before this one, titled Africa Must Be Modern. And back then, and this is what I believe, now, the next worst thing to living under a capitalist regime is to live under a no-name regime. And outside of South Africa, all of Africa is no-name regimes. Okay? So when people ask me, and I've had the privilege of living in South Korea and studying as part of my study of what I call late transitions to modernity, South Korea chose this path deliberately. They even set a timetable, a year, and you know what their benchmark was? They said South Korea should be a member of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. That is the club of the big countries in the world. They are all capitalist. And South Korea chose that path. Now Nigeria, my country that never chose any path, goes to beg for arms right now from South Korea. South Korea has only 48 million people. Nigeria has 200 million people. Come on. If you are producing enough shoes for children in Nigeria, within Nigeria, would you need to go and beg for aid from South Korea? What part of colonialism stops you from doing that? I talked my own younger brother's friend out of investing in a cashew plantation in Nigeria. Because I said to him, if I had my way, I would cut down every goddamn cocoa tree in Nigeria. The market in cabbage, global market in cabbage, is bigger than the global market in cocoa. You grow the cocoa, you don't refine it, you don't add any value to it. Whoever wants to buy it from you gets to walk all over you. They determine which one is grade A, which one is grade B, which one is grade C. And you say today, I don't agree with you, they tell you go eat your cocoa, and you can't do anything with it. This is what I mean by, please let our young people know so that they can have a different future. If you want to build capitalism, go right ahead. In Brazil now, they don't argue, even Lula da Silva, when he took over the first time, he didn't do anything to mess with that economy because he knew that a productive economy was what was going to give him the funds to lift the most people out of poverty in history. There's no country in Africa that has that. I don't care what French companies, what British companies, and so on and so forth are doing. When we get on with the business of having a productive economy, and Nigeria is a very good example because you mentioned, young people, and so they are protesting again today. But guess what? The government that just took over, that is there right now, may be the first government that we have led by somebody who actually understands how the global economy works. Because Nigeria was on the brink of what happened in Sri Lanka 2 years ago. Sri Lanka did not have a single farthing to import anything. So when people write me from Nigeria, where the IMF and the World Bank, I say, remember, these are voluntary clubs. Nigeria does not have to belong to the IMF. But when you go to the IMF, whether you are Nigeria or you are Greece, people forget what happened to Greece after the 2008 crisis, and they were going to be kicked out of the euro unless they took all those bitter pills, from the IMF. Look at where Greece is today. Nigeria is not there. But your intellectuals are busy going around the IMF and the World Bank. So I said, listen, Nigeria should withdraw its membership of the IMF. It's not a compulsory club. So if you have other ways of growing your economy, and you know the country that has now had to float its currency in Africa, after all decades of insisting that it was never going to happen, because now they have to go to the IMF to keep their economy on track, Ethiopia. Please, I'm not interested in politics, I'm interested in the quality of life for people. And if you are not producing anything, you are distributing poverty. You are not going to be able to have the jobs for your young people when they graduate from school. Because where are you going to put them? Meanwhile, if you have a productive economy, when things go down in one sector, they move to other sectors. There's only one sector in most African countries. It's called government. This is 2024. We can't keep doing the same thing. And intellectuals are absolutely crucial to this. In 1997, when the Asian collapse happened, when I went to Korea, I saw many street vendors, many of them with double college degrees and all that. That was what the 1997 crisis led them to. But look at where South Korea is today. And you don't even need to go to South Korea. You see all those desert countries called U.A.E, Qatar? My former president in Nigeria was visiting Qatar so many times that at some point Qatar said, don't come back. Think of the insult. Come on. This is where agency comes in. You can't keep going around and say people are disrespecting you. I was in graduate school in Canada when, South Korean cars started coming to North America. They were the butt of jokes by late-night comedians. Does anybody joke about South Korean cars anymore? They are eating Americans' lunch. And somebody wants me to believe that Africans cannot do that? No, I'm sorry. I cannot get on that road. There's no road there. We should get off it yesterday.
One more question?
This is, I guess, maybe for you, Professor Taiwo, or actually anybody can kind of chime in. Do you think, you mentioned the experience of African Americans in America. Do you think there's an opportunity following that model, which sort of produces a hybrid culture, a hybrid approach? You take some of this, thinking about jazz music. It's neither a European music nor an African music. In some ways, it's taking the best of both to fuse it into something that's completely new. Do you see that as sort of an alternative to, you mentioned the binaries of has to be all this or it has to be all that, and as a project not of deconstruction, but of creation? Do you see that as a possibility in Africa?
Absolutely. And actually, once you get away from intellectuals, that's what ordinary people do. The anxieties are about us, intellectuals. I grew up in the market. And that anxiety, all the writings of the decolonizers, I hate to break it to you, they are not written for people in Africa. They are written for the grants that they get here. And the same grants that they use in South Africa. I mean, recently, somebody was going to talk about decolonial and so on and so forth. And who was funding it? MacArthur Foundation. But once you begin to say that, listen, we're better than this, you're going to find a way to ensure that, what are you doing exporting cashews from Nigeria to Vietnam? What technology does it require for you to roast cashew, for crying out loud? And the possibilities are always there. For the first time in its history, 5 years ago, Botswana set up the first diamond processing. What took them so long? What took them so long? And Botswana is one of the better countries in the continent. My point is, intellectuals should stop promoting this Africans can't do stuff. Stop promoting this permanent subalternity of Africans and begin to fire the imagination of our young people to conquer the world, because they can.
We have one last question.
Thank you. This comes from an online attendee, Nwandi Lawson. Are you aware of sources where we may learn about promising contemporary examples of liberation, education, and economics among previously colonized and enslaved populations, perhaps even small initiatives at the grassroots?
Who is that for? Not for me.
Either of you. Either of
What's the question again?
So are you aware of any sources or examples that we can learn about promising contemporary examples of liberation, education, and economics among previously colonized populations?
That's why I said that cannot be for me, because that's not my deal.
Yeah, I'll just give my thought about that. I think the question can be applied to any former colonies, because I work on liberation movement in former Portuguese colonies, and one of my first interests was to read the program of the liberation movement. What were their goals after they got independence? And I think many of them were in a very ambiguous situation, because, and the reason not given to me by some of former leader of liberation movement, that we struggle for our independence in the middle of the Cold War, and you want to make sure that you won't be in trouble with the main power around, because we want, first of all, to make our cause succeed. But the problem was that they need to define clearly, once they have it and have independence, what were the goal? Was it to replicate the kind of the same capitalist economy that was at the base of the colonization of the country, or to try to offer something else? Hence the debate about the progressive regime in Africa, the non-progressive regime, the so-called conservative and other even Marxist regime in Africa. You can decide to become a Marxist regime in Africa. The problem was the following. Which control do you have on your raw material? You produce it, you have no control about the international market. And I lived in Angola for many years, the country that was at war. I mean, I could see the difficulty of being independent, claiming your vision, but not mastering the economy, because Angola is an oil producer. But who decide about the price of the oil? Not the Angolan, for example. So this was one of the key difficulty, how to make your revolutionary ideal succeed, and to confront the reality of world economy. And this has been the challenge, I think, up to date. Some countries succeed. I live in Botswana for 6 months. This is I call this success story country because, Botswana, almost forgotten country. They have diamond and cattle, but it's so well managed. So well managed that for someone coming from a chaotic country like my own, you are surprised. Say, okay, so we can do it. It's not kind of African or curse, no, you can do it. So it's about the choice, but also the ability of local elite to manage the country. So,
Just one final point, if I may. Please, students, check out one country, there's now two countries, and put to the test some of what I shared with you. The country used to be called Guinea-Bissau and Cape Verde. Okay? Now there are two countries. Cape Verde went the neoliberal way. Guinea-Bissau did not. Cape Verde was the first country in Africa, and I think still the only one, to move to the status of a middle-income country, based 150% on tourism. Guinea-Bissau has degenerated into a narco state as we speak. So please, don't take my word for it. Go do your own research and come to your own conclusions. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you so much for that most interesting panel. And John, thank you very much for moderating. I have to apologize that I didn't introduce our speakers. There was a misunderstanding and I'm at fault. There was a whole bio that I needed to read about both Professors Mabeko-Tali and Professor Taiwo, so my apologies for that. And I have to tell you, I want to say that today's event would not have been possible if it wasn't for my great colleague, Dr. Sangeeta Madhavan, who is the chair of the African American and Africana Studies program. Would stand up, please, Sangeeta? Really, I owe this to her, and I am grateful that we did this. But I think this is just the beginning of a conversation. Thank you so much for being here today. And I just want to tell you that for those of you who are interested, our next event is our annual lecture, which will be given by Dr. Brandon M. Terry from Harvard University on the level of human rights, Malcolm X and the dilemmas of Black internationalism then and now. And our last event this semester is on gun violence in America. Dr. Thomas Apt and Jacqueline Childkraut. Dr. Apt is at the University of Maryland, and Dr. Childkraut is at the Rockefeller Institute. So please look at our website, look at our events on our website, and join us for our upcoming events. Thank you for coming today.